Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Pete Cosgrove. I've been managing the Suffolk Marine Pioneer for the last 3 years locally. And today I'm going to give you a window into what we've been doing, run through the lessons and recommendations that we've gleaned for applying a natural capital approach in England. So a tiny little bit of background. Now, the Pioneer program was set up by DEFRA in 2016 on the basis that we were to fulfill 4 objectives to inform the iteration and implementation of the government's 25-year environment plan that set grand ambition to improve the state of the environment within a generation. The 4 objectives that we were given, along with the other Pioneer projects, were to test new tools and approaches, particularly to apply a natural capital approach in practice, to demonstrate joined-up integrated approaches to planning and delivery, to pioneer new opportunities for funding, and then lastly, to share lessons and best practice when we've understood what works. Now, I'm not going to go into the background from a natural capital side of things, but what I will do briefly is just define the expectation of what a natural capital approach is intended to do. And in essence, this is to empower decision makers to make better decisions through growing their understanding of the value and the benefits the natural environment provides to a given human population as a consequence of a functioning environment and a functioning ecosystem services. And that logic is provided by understanding the habitats, the species, and the physical environments that you're dealing with, defining the ecosystem functions and the processes that result from that environment, understanding the services that those functions and processes provide, and then specifically looking at what benefits the human population derive from those ecosystem services. It's worth noting that the natural capital approach is the process, and it's a process to inform decision making. So I just want to run through that very quickly, and this is an adaptation from the Natural Capital Committee's How to Do It framework published in 2016. In essence, you start with an appreciation, a vision of what you want to achieve. You need to understand where your current position sits relative to that vision. You build an evidence base to understand what your opportunities in terms of intervention, in terms of possible action are, and that evidence base takes you forward and leads you to define possible opportunities through an options process. And the idea is you implement your chosen option or options through a natural capital plan. And you do that on the presumption that you can gain funding to deliver those interventions and actions. Now, Pioneer was, as the name suggests, testing the new approach, testing a natural capital approach. But what that actually means in practice wasn't defined when the project started. So I just want to take you through a few assumptions that we had to make. And these may be quite obvious, but need to be stated. Firstly, natural capital and its place within the 25-year plan looks to raise the bar from environmental conservation and preservation towards environmental improvement and enhancement. We're looking here at natural capital decision making at a local or place-based level. And that requires decision makers at that level to be empowered to make decisions informed by the evidence that is coming from the natural capital evidence base and detailed within the process. The idea of the Pioneer is to test lessons locally, but those tools and the recommendations should be applicable across the country and available to others. So it's not just case specific, it's providing a case study from which others can learn from. A key assumption is that funding for environmental management is scarce, as it has been over the last decade or so, and just because we're looking at a new approach doesn't mean that a great wad of cash is waiting for us at the end of the rainbow. So we make the assumption that funding is scarce and we're working within limited resource space. And then finally, quite a key assumption is that natural capital approaches will be delivered in partnership. And the easiest way to justify that assumption is to consider any one natural asset, whether it's a woodland, whether it's a salt marsh, whether it's a particular area of marine space. In almost all cases, that particular asset or the ecosystem that you're looking at won't be owned, managed, and run by one organisation with an autocratic power. It's going to have interests and have management interests from a wide variety of partners. And to succeed, you need to work in partnership, an agreed approach, and work collaboratively to deliver that. What I want to go through today is three key themes of lessons, the first of which is evidence. I'm showing this diagram again, but I want to focus on the center of it where the evidence block is. And as one of the 5 blocks within this diagram, one word evidence doesn't sum up the complexity of what the evidence base actually entails. The first thing to consider is how that evidence base is communicated. And natural capital asserts that the best way to communicate understanding of the environment is to do so in terms that are universally understood by decision makers currently. So if we look at currency, managers are quite familiar with dealing with asset registers, with risk registers, and with accounts. The idea for natural capital is that we frame the environment in these terms so that they can be considered alongside any other possibility or action, be it political, social, or economic. So it's to put the environment on equal footing. But these tools, behind that, there were specific pieces of evidence and specific groups of evidence that need to be unpicked. And to give you a flavour of that, you need to understand what the physical environment is, what the stocks of those natural assets are, how those assets provide ecosystem services and how they provide the benefits, so in terms of flow. You need to understand what the risks and trends are to those stocks and assets and the trends of use or reliance on those flows. You also need to understand who the beneficiaries are, who is benefiting from this, because that defines who you're delivering for. And then in terms of communicating this through those tools I've mentioned earlier, you need to be able to place a value, universal value on these flows. And from that, you can inform your options and implementation. So looking at what we did in Suffolk, the colours will be familiar from the very first slide that we looked at. On the left, we've got the marine ecosystem. In the middle, we've got the processes and the functions, sometimes referred to as supporting ecosystem services. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, we've got provisional, regulatory, and cultural services. And within those are the different benefits that salt marsh provides to a human population. And these benefits have been defined through existing literature. And those benefits that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that we considered for the Suffolk Pioneer. What I want to do next is just kind of illustrate the relative progress that we made in terms of realizing that complete evidence base. So if you consider the whole yellow bar as being, we've got a brilliant understanding of this particular benefit and that question of risk, of beneficiaries, of values, you can see we didn't quite get that for any of the benefits that we looked at. And the reason is because that evidence base is so vast and it's so complex. Because we were looking from a, in effect, an austere point of view, we were trying to do and deliver this understanding in a repeatable, replicable, transferable way. And that meant we didn't throw money at it. We wanted to understand what could be achieved generically across the board. And this is kind of the progress that we made. That's not to say that you can't progress with this level of understanding. It's just to highlight that it's not easy, and there are definitely easier benefits, easier system services to go after than others. But that doesn't mean you should try to go after certain ones. You should try and get a complete picture as possible, this is the picture that we were able to get. So looking at some of those gaps, this is what I want to focus on for the moment. The first thing you need to do is you need to understand what your extent and condition of your physical assets are. Now, extent's quite easy to do from a salt marsh perspective, which is where we focused our attentions. The Suffolk salt marsh of the 5 estuaries, particularly in the Deben estuary in southeast Suffolk. The question of what defines asset condition is open to interpretation, and ultimately, when we're looking at ecosystem services and the benefits that we get from an environment, the condition is dependent on what ecosystem service and what benefit you're looking at. It's possible that different types of condition yield different benefits, so you can't have a universal underlying for condition. You need to consider what ecosystem service and what benefits you want to derive from a particular asset. For salt marsh, we had some available data, priority habitat data, aerial and LiDAR data from the Environment Agency, as well as some national vegetative classification data that unfortunately wasn't available digitally. And the available data that we had meant that we didn't have much of an understanding of condition, barring condition assessments from Natural England, which were done at a triple SI level, so looking at across the entirety of the Deben estuary, or the subsections within that. And investigating that, it didn't really quantify or qualify what condition meant in terms of ecosystem service provision. So what we did was we worked with University of Essex, and they were able to define a methodology that linked the physical attributes and physical morphology of the salt marsh to provide a proxy for condition. And in effect, it was the proportion of vegetated versus the proportion of creeks within a healthy salt marsh, and that was known to be 88% vegetated and 12% creeks. And by using the publicly available data that we had and a couple of relatively simple GIS techniques, 3-stage process, University of Essex were able to define condition at a very high resolution to, in effect, quantify which particular area of marsh was in a certain condition. And the black box highlights the veg cover and non-vegetative cover for 4 areas of marsh at the top end of the Deben estuary. And you can see from that there's variation, even at a very local scale. But what if you were to provide that as a proportion? You could identify relative condition of marsh from a proportional scale, and you can use that to inform your understanding of ecosystem service provision, and that's exactly what we did. So with that understanding of extent and condition, we were able to look at what ecosystem services and what benefits were linked to the physical attributes and the physical extent and condition of the marsh. It's true for the marine space that ecosystem function and process often play a more dominant role in determining the provision of ecosystem services and benefits than the extent and condition do, but there are some services and benefits, namely carbon sequestration and storage and the provision of fish, that link and correlate quite well with condition. So in effect, using the known metric of condition, university again able to define provision of service for fish on the right hand side, and I don't expect you to be able to see this, and carbon storage and carbon sequestration on the left, on the smaller table. We were able to define the provision of service for these 3 types of service, provision of benefit for these 3 types of service. And with that, there is a need to then progress that from being provided in a series of data tables to a meaningful value, which is exactly what we did through applying the government's Green Book on accounting methodologies with the help of natural capital solutions to understand what this provision of service meant in terms of value. And again, I won't go into too much detail with the tables here. The idea is that the notes and the links that I provide at the end of this webinar will give you the level of detail that you need, either an overview or the full story, depending on what you require. But those links will be provided at the end of the webinar. Bottom line being that we were able to put monetary value on 3 types of benefit across the immediate term and across a 5, 10, and 15-year horizon, chosen on the basis of management horizons, various management horizons. The question that came out as a consequence of providing this valuation is actually what is this value? Who is this value for? Who are we valuing this for? It's all well and good putting a number on it, putting a financial figure on it, but that doesn't actually mean much in terms of management terms, in terms of decision making, unless we can attribute that value to a particular person, a group, or an organisation. We'll touch on that later, particularly around behavioural change. Another piece of work I want to share with you is the work that University of Cambridge, Iris Muller and Martin Rogers did for us. And those that are familiar with the East Coast will know it's a very dynamic coastline, and that coastal protection is particularly high up the list of priorities from a regulatory and from a stakeholder point of view. Now, coastal protection is a well-known service that is provided from salt marsh, but the question we had is quite how much coastal protection is the marsh along the Deben estuary really providing at a given location. And again, using very simple GIS techniques that are could be picked up by anyone with access to QGIS or an equivalent program. Iris Muller and Martin Rogers were able to define and quantify ecosystem and benefit provision by looking at physical attributes. So they took wind data, they took understanding of fetch, they took the width and height of marshes, all from publicly available data, calculated some constants based on previous work, and then were able to provide this and calculate the precise nature of coastal protection that 10 meters squared or 10 meter length of marsh would provide at any one point up and down the Deben. And this is shown on the 2 diagrams on the right. And we're able to show that because we considered the change in coastal protection without marsh, so in effect what the entire marsh offers in terms of coastal protection, which is on the right, and then a slightly more realistic, let's say, 10-meter reduction of marsh, in the case of strong coastal erosion or coastal change, and that is on the left-hand side. So this was brilliant because it answered key questions that the community and regulators had in terms of what service provision is this marsh providing, and that can obviously inform decision making. But the question is, is this information, is this evidence base, is this natural capital evidence base useful? We've got some brilliant examples of quantifying ecosystem service through techniques that are easily applied, highly resolved, and readily transferable. So if we look back again at this diagram, the idea is that the evidence base is supposed to inform your options for intervention. But we're having a big blocker here because although we had values in some cases, although we had quantified the provision of certain services, we were struggling to gain any traction with that information, partly because it was of how it was presented, which meant we need to consider how we communicate that evidence. Not only how we're communicating, but why we're communicating it. And chiefly, we're communicating the evidence to decision makers to provide influence. And influence is the key thing. So what we did is we considered one of the key tools that natural capital approach promotes, that being an asset register, to provide all of that quantitative information in one simple table. and we're able to do that. So this is our asset register, if you will, for the services that we considered, the services and the benefits that we considered within the DBEN. Don't want to worry about the detail too much. I just want to take you through 3 points. Firstly, in some cases, for the provision of fish, carbon storage and carbon sequestration, we were able to, in effect, complete the asset register as far as possible. We were able to identify the benefit, we were able to quantify the service provision, and we were able to place a value per area on that, which was excellent or very good. Secondly, the work of Iris and Martin in terms of defining the prevention of erosion and provision of coastal protection. We had highly resolved numbers, but we couldn't put those into this table because it is so location specific. We weren't able to put a value on that because that value piece of work happened before this piece of work was complete, but theoretically we could do that as well. This in itself presents a problem by not being able to present that highly resolved information within a simple table. But more pressingly is the fact that despite decent understanding across these five benefits, we were not able to identify who the beneficiaries were. And when we consider the question of influence, that is a key thing. Because until you understand who the beneficiaries are, you're not understanding who you're trying to influence and what the consequences of either that loss or gain or service and benefit is. So let's look at the question of communicating. And what I want to do is just to familiarise you with this diagram. If you consider the evidence base that's so fundamental to the natural capital approach as the green triangle, at the bottom you've got your core components for that. You need to first understand the extent and condition of your physical assets before you can determine what the ecosystem services are. You need to build up your understanding of benefits before you can put a definitive, informative and influential value on that. So you can kind of consider the sections that are below any one of those pieces of components of evidence as being dependent on those that are below it. And if we look on the left-hand side, we're thinking about three audiences here. We're thinking about audiences. So on the kind of quantifying ecosystem services and quantifying extent and condition of assets, it's very much life sciences. It's very much considered on a scientific basis, a high degree of quantification, often significant amounts of statistical testing, and communicated more often than not in scientific papers. When we think about what's happening on the ground, we think about social reality. For the most part, if you're walking your dog along the coast or taking your family out to the forest, you don't think in scientific terms in terms of why you're benefiting. You just enjoy it, and you benefit for the reasons that are specific to you. It's your social reality, and it's specific to communities and to individuals. But what we're trying to do is just trying to communicate that scientific basis and the social reality to decision makers through values. And we've got three barriers here: a barrier between scientific basis and social reality, a barrier between communication, decision makers and social reality, and again, the old chestnut of the barriers to scientific communication to deliver influence at a decision-making level. So you need to address these three barriers if you are going to give your natural capital evidence base influence. So as I said, there's a need to communicate across these three barriers. And we've tried to do that. Firstly, looking across values in terms of decision makers and social reality. What you wanted to do is to bring that social reality to the doorstep of those decision makers. And we work with Darryl Burden, Tavis Potts, University of Hull, Darryl Burden Consultancies, and University of Aberdeen to take a participatory approach to deliver that. Secondly, the challenge of communicating the kind of scientific basis towards the kind of social lived reality and then incorporating that lived reality within the scientific basis. We undertook a photography competition to, in effect, raise different perspectives and break down the barriers for barriers of communication by taking a step back and then bringing people up to speed collectively. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. And then finally, the reason that asset and risk registers and natural capital accounts are heralded is that as the means to communicate the scientific understanding of benefits of ecosystem services of natural capital towards decision makers, and to influence that. That's best done through those tools. So a little bit more on these three things. Firstly, the participatory approach that we took. Now, we took this because we were struggling to understand the full value of the salt marsh, and we wanted to draw in the community and draw in different perspectives to build up a wider picture of value before taking it to decision makers. And by working with University of Hull, University of Aberdeen and Alberta consultancies, we were able to build the understanding of the community about natural capital, about how ecosystem services and benefits derive from natural landscapes. And we were able to get them to identify their perspective of how that worked within the local vicinity. So on the right-hand side here, you've got a little map, multicolored map, that shows all of the different natural features that the community was able to identify. And on the left-hand side, you've got a map which is predominantly dominated by red colouring, and that is showing the benefit of carbon sequestration as defined by the community from the habitats and features that were identified in the map on the right. Again, the links to this and the interactive PDF will be at the end of this document, and I'll encourage you to delve into there for more detail. But that wasn't enough to kind of really inform the value side of things of a participatory approach. What we were able to do then, once the stakeholders had identified features and understood the benefits and told us the benefits that derive from those, we were able to then look at how hypothetical scenarios might change those benefits, might change provision of those benefits, and ask the question of what that might mean for the community, how that change manifests, who it benefits, and how that impacts. And we played out two scenarios with the community. The first scenario, which is depicted on the left, which was in effect a change from vegetated salt marsh to mudflat under a sea level rise scenario. And then secondly, scenario 2 was a change from farmland to salt marsh under a hypothetical managed realignment scenario. And what these bars and the arrows are showing you is the mean perceived impact of benefits under scenario 1 and scenario 2 from business as usual. So where they're in -1, -2, there's a perception of reductions in benefits, and when it's the positive side, obviously there's a perception that those benefits increase. The length of the arrows and the dotted arrows indicate variance between groups. So obviously in some cases there's a lot of variation, a lot of difference of opinion, but in some there's more rounded, more consensus about how that benefit change. It's quite a small group, but it's just to show you what can be done, and that information is very useful in terms of supplementing the quantified scientific evidence base, combining that with this understanding lived social reality of benefits and beneficiaries, and being quite usefully applied to decision making. Okay, so that's that communication side of things. Just again briefly looking at the question of breaking down the communication barrier between, so there's the social reality and the scientific understanding. Now, it's necessary to engage quite a wide audience with this idea of natural capital decision making, the natural capital approach, especially if we're looking at place-based decision making, because regardless of what you're doing, what habitat you're looking at, you are intending to build up a plan that has a series of possible interventions that you would like to implement, which would mean change. And that change, from a local place-based decision-making perspective, needs to provide benefit to the local community, and that understanding needs to be brought on board as early as possible, because the less resistance you have, the more support you have, the easier it is to implement that plan. So it's necessary to break down this communication barrier and engage with the wide, often public audience, to bring them on side and understand what would work and what wouldn't for them. And when you start talking with jargon, natural capital, asset register, ecosystem services, people immediately switch off. And the bottom line is that individuals have different perceptions of what value means, and that social reality is very different depending on who you are, where you live, what your experiences are. So we thought the best way to kind of break down this was to start the conversation around what is your perception of nature's value. And that's exactly what we did through this photography competition. It's just one example on the right-hand side of the screen here. We asked people to submit a photo under one of the 4 categories of ecosystem services, and to accompany it with a caption that demonstrated or illustrated why this picture represented that particular type of ecosystem service. And we found that we had genuinely hundreds of different perspectives on different environments. But that wasn't divisive. That was actually quite unifying, because it allowed both scientists, community, and regulators to understand that perspective from a very low bar in terms of technical understanding, and begin that conversation around differences of perspective, what value meant more broadly, how value can be combined, and really helped bridge that gap between scientific understanding and the understanding and lived reality of the community. We found this a brilliant tool, and would thoroughly recommend it to anyone taking a place-based natural capital approach. So yeah, that's that. And then, yeah, as I said, finally, we followed the framework to communicate our natural capital evidence base through tools that were familiar to decision makers. In this case, this is the Deben and Salt Marsh Asset Register that we were able to produce. And as we said before, that question of beneficiaries we weren't able to answer, and as with the Rogers and Muller work, we weren't able to provide the figures within within the table itself, which raises questions about how one presents data. But it did pose an issue for us in terms of providing all that information to one simple table. Now, the question of beneficiaries isn't a question about communication. It's actually a question about influence. Because although you're able to communicate this to the extent that you can do through a table, what you're doing is you're lacking any influence without an understanding of beneficiaries. So I'll look at that next. And the reason, as I said before, is because the evidence base isn't able to lead the discussion on what options should be selected and then how it should be implemented without that understanding of who benefits, who the beneficiaries are. And the reason that's the case is because the natural capital approach is actually more complicated than we first looked at. Not only do you have the different components of evidence, but you've also got various decision-making points throughout this process before you even get to implementation. And these are represented by the little orange circles here. And at every decision-making point, you've got the opportunity for individuals to make decisions and to be influenced by external, outside, potentially irrational factors. And these factors have been drawn from psychology, but I'm not going to go into them now, just to highlight that these are issues and that the evidence base needs to drive a strong course despite the influence of external, often irrational factors, and that is a challenge. So in terms of meeting that challenge, we recognise it's about changing people's behaviour. We need to be led by the evidence and not influenced by the external factors. And the little hashed arrows, as they are, indicate an incomplete link. So we've got an evidence base, but it's incomplete. We've got a communicable format, but it's not perfect. We've got some influence by having that communicable format, but clearly it's not working. And that's because of the lack of understanding of beneficiaries. And the reason that lack of understanding of beneficiaries is so important because it defines responsibility. As soon as you understand who benefits, you understand who holds responsibility or who holds a stake and interest in that. And what we did is we worked again with Darryl Burden, University of Aberdeen as well, to consider reliance as a step along the chain towards responsibility. And what these two radar plots show you is on the left-hand side, you've got the perspective of a water company. On the right-hand side, you've got the perspective of the boatyards. The table at the bottom is the benefits that were identified by that participatory approach that I showed to you about 10 minutes ago. And what the radar plots indicate from a scale of 0 being the center, 1 being the inner ring, 2 and 3 being the outer ring, is the relative reliance of each of these company types on these types of benefits. So in effect, the relationship between that organization and the benefits. And if you can take it a step forward, you can then infer, if you understand where your benefits come from, you can identify the relationship between organizations and particular habitats in terms of the benefits and ecosystem service they provide. So obviously, the larger the plot or section, the higher or more reliant that company, that organization is on that. And that's quite interesting because, firstly, what you can do with that information is you can compare different different organizations' reliance on the same type of habitat or the same environment. So these are just, this slide just shows those two radar plots overlaid with the boatyards in grey, and the slightly kind of hazy colour is where they overlap. So for benefit 22, for example, water quality, both the water company and the boatyards have a strong reliance on good water quality within the Deben, whereas, let's say, 15, the aesthetic benefits are much more important to the water to the boatyards, than the water company, who shows it's of no relevance to them whatsoever. And that's interesting because you can start conversations amongst different parties, different partners that wouldn't otherwise have considered they have overlapping interests. If you take this one step further, you can look to identify relative demand within a particular area. Now, we generated these radar plots specifically for the Deben estuary, and that reliance on those particular benefits within the estuary. Again, you need to take it a stage further to understand how those benefits relate to the assets and the physical environment, but that can be done simply through considering the literature. And you can compare relative perspectives, and as I said, provide an understanding and potential areas for collaboration for two or more very different companies, organizations, interests, where there's common ground, common interest in the provision of one, two, or many ecosystem services. And if you relate that back to where that benefit comes from, the particular asset, you have identified multiple organization interest in the preservation, enhancement, sustainability of particular assets. And that is particularly useful because it can inform decision making. In effect, you can start to answer the question of who benefits by considering these radar plots. And again, we were able to generate these on a very, very small budget working off the participatory approach we'd started, and that's really helped us to answer that question of how you communicate a scientific basis to the decision makers through improving and developing that asset register to be a more comprehensive picture. But we're looking at behavior change here. And in effect, what we did with those radar plots is we'd previously been looking at the habitats, the physical environment, defining how the ecosystem functions, understanding the services, and then understanding how that relates to human well-being. But what we did to generate those radar plots was simply look at the reverse side of things. So look how humans benefit, to identify the services they benefit from, understand what processes and functions deliver those services, and then look back to the habitats. It's worth noting that this is something that we considered very early on. But in terms of looking at the government's ambition to improve the state of the environment, there's a very good reason why we didn't look at this direction of travel from the human perspective to start with, and that is because you want to, the government's plan sets out to enhance and improve the state of the environment within 25 years. And if we're looking at a human perspective, we may improve it from a human perspective, but that raises large questions about what we actually deliver from an environmental perspective. It's like considering a farm would be managed for human benefit, but in terms of the biodiversity, in terms of the ecosystem function, it's very, very specific to human benefit and doesn't necessarily deliver on wider environmental improvement. So it's just a point of note. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is just two pieces of work that aren't actually within the Pioneer, although complement very well. Firstly, the work of 3 Keel that have, in effect, done this logic chain from the beneficiaries' function as ecosystem services, looking back to the assets. They've done something quite similar, but on a slightly broader scale, and are working with companies in Cumbria and other locations across the country to develop that a little bit further. And also some UN-backed work, which has developed a tool called Encore, which is in effect what we've done with the radar plots, but at a national scale. So they've done the legwork in terms of relating the benefit back to the service, the human benefit back to the service, and then back to the assets and physical environment, but they've done it on a very broad scale. Our work's great because it does it at a very specific scale, and you work with participatory approaches to local stakeholders. You can understand and define responsibility locally. Just 2 tools that we wanted to raise here because it's quite similar pieces of work, but well worth looking at. And then moving on. So what I want to go through here is just the last few points. And behaviour change is so important to deliver a natural capital approach because it's about being empowered to make more informed, better choices. And the reason we consider these radar plots is because it communicates the issues and the state of the environment in terms that organisations understand, in effect, in terms of risk. And they're defined by risk by the organisations that have come to the table and generated those plots for them. It's not an external or third party telling them how or why they should address their behaviour. The route to behaviour change must come from the organisations, the individuals, the countries, the states that need to implement the behaviour change, and that will only happen as a consequence of understanding the risk from that business perspective, not radically changing their outlook or their philanthropic outlook, but actually changing to ensure the sustainability of the business or the organisation. So that discussion of risk and how it's communicated in terms of decision making is critical to deliver that behaviour change. And the work of 3 Keel, of Encore, and the radar plots that Darryl Burden, Tavis Potts, and Suffolk Marine Pioneer has considered is critical to that. So just finally, I started today by saying that this presentation was a window into the Suffolk Marine Pioneer, and it's just been that, really. What I've wanted to do is just provide a little bit of context and then touch on some of the key lessons, notably evidence, communication, behaviour change, and the work that we've done around those issues. And I'm hoping that this provides insight to those looking to deliver a natural capital approach at all levels across the country and maybe beyond. But in terms of that window, the question of where you can go next is quite useful. So there are 2 summary documents and then the technical reports that provide detail into some of the work that I've provided today. The 2 technical, well, the 2 summary reports, one is an executive summary and one is about a 50-page document that takes you through this in much more detail, are available on the website that's linked below. And just to make it clear, in terms of how these lessons and how these recommendations are presented within these documents, it's just through 4 themes. And the reason they're through 4 themes is basically addressing what needs to change in order to deliver a successful natural capital approach. Firstly, the recognition that change in terms of how we currently do things is required. Governance, because, as I mentioned at the start of this, natural capital is likely to involve working in partnership, which means working with people, and getting governance structures, sets of responsibility and roles set up from the offset is critically important, so good governance structure is important. We've looked at presenting lessons in terms of the methods and the approaches that you could use to deliver some of these lessons and recommendations. So the work of Essex, of Hull and Aberdeen, and the work of Cambridge has been presented in terms of these are methods that can be applied to salt marsh and to potentially other habitats to inform your approaches to natural capital and improve your evidence base. And also, we've recommended changes in terms of funding because of that assumption that funding is limited, and potential considerations that you'd like to make or should make with regard to how you consider delivering funding. And we've made these recommendations against the natural capitals framework, those 5 stages to deliver a natural capital approach. So you've got those recommendations, those 4 themes of delivery with lessons coming out from each stage, all summarised within that 1 report and then the executive summary. So yeah, please do take a look at those 2 documents and then consider the technical reports that sit below them if you're interested. Otherwise, give me an email. My email address is at the bottom of the screen. Googling Suffolk Marine Pioneer will take you to that link, but it's there should you need it. Thank you very much.